Hi guys, Miss Francis here. Today I want to give you a look at the overall reaction of photosynthesis as well as explore some essential pigments that are used during that process. So photosynthesis, just like cellular respiration, is a redox reaction. So what does it mean to be a redox reaction? Well, something's going to get reduced or something else is going to get oxidized. So carbon dioxide is going to be reduced. It's going to gain an electron or gain a hydrogen to form sugar, whereas water is going to get oxidized. So water is going to lose an electron or lose a hydrogen, and that's where our oxygen comes from. Now, the two major stages involved in photosynthesis are the light reaction and the dark reaction. Within these two stages, there are intermediate stages, but these are the two overall larger stages. So the light reaction converts solar energy to chemical energy. The dark reaction, which is also called the Calvin cycle, takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and uses energy from the light reaction to reduce carbon dioxide, or that new carbon piece, to sugar. So let's take a look at these overall reactions known as the light reaction and the dark reaction. So the light reaction requires pigments, which are going to be found in the thylakoid. Now, if I take stacks of thylakoids, that's going to form the grana. Whereas the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma, which is similar to the matrix in the mitochondria. It's that liquid portion. So if we look at what's needed for photosynthesis to happen, you've got water. Water is going to be taken in through the stomates, and it is going to be hydrolyzed or split. So when that water undergoes hydrolysis, it's going to exit through the stomates as oxygen. So exits through the stomates. And then that oxygen can be used for cellular respiration. So that oxygen is going to play a vital role in cellular respiration, used for cellular respiration. All right, now let's look at that carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide also enters from the atmosphere through the stomates, and that carbon dioxide is going to be reduced. So when that carbon dioxide gets reduced, it's going to form sugar. Some other things that you should know about this photosynthetic reaction is, let's take a look at this hydrogen, where the hydrogen ends up. So remember, within every hydrogen molecule, you've got an electron and you've got a proton, right? So the electrons are going to reduce NADP plus to NADPH, whereas the hydrogen, this is your proton, that's going to help set up your proton gradient. It's going to be used during chemiosmosis, where the ATP that is produced can then be used for the dark reaction or the Calvin cycle. So this is the overall picture of photosynthesis. Eventually, we'll get to the nitty-gritty regarding photosynthesis, but before we get there, I would like to focus on the pigments that are located in the thylakoid of the chloroplast, which is necessary for photosynthesis to occur. So the thylakoids are going to convert light energy into chemical energy. And by chemical energy, I'm talking about that energy that's stored in organic molecules. In this case, we're talking about sugar, specifically glucose. Well, what is light energy? Light energy is a type of kinetic energy. In other words, it's also known as electromagnetic radiation. Now, this electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic energy is going to travel in the form of waves, where the distance between the crests of these electromagnetic waves is called the wavelength. The electromagnetic spectrum includes the entire range of the electromagnetic radiation. We are concerned about this little sliver right here, which is the visible light section of the electromagnetic spectrum. The visible light section, that's Roy G. Biv, you might remember, right? Roy G. Biv. Those are the colors that we're able to see. So not only does light travel as a wave, but light also travels as discrete particles or little small particles called photons, where the amount of energy packed into a photon is inversely related to its wavelength, meaning the bigger the wavelength, the less the energy. So which color is associated with the most energy, but the shortest wavelength? That's going to be violet. Whereas the wavelength of the color associated with the least energy and therefore the longest wavelength, this is the symbol for wavelength, is going to be red. So when we see color, it's because we're looking at the wavelength of light that's reflected back to our eyes. If we're seeing white, that's because all the colors are reflected. Whereas if we see an object appearing black, that's because all the colors are absorbed. Think about a hot day in the summer. If you're wearing a white t-shirt, all of the light is reflected off of you. Whereas if you're wearing a black t-shirt, all of the light from the sun, you're absorbing it. So you tend to get warmer if you're wearing a black shirt in the winter. So if I'm looking at an apple, the reason why I would see red is because every other color besides red is absorbed. Red is going to be reflected back. So similarly, a leaf looks green because green light is being reflected back, whereas red and blue are being absorbed. Now, what's absorbing that red and blue light? Those are the pigments that I'm talking about. So the dominant pigment that's going to be found in the thylakoid is called chlorophyll A. If we look at this chart, it's a chart showing us the absorbance of light by the three different pigments that play a crucial role in photosynthesis. So you've got chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and your carotenoids. We'll get more detail about these pigments in a little bit, but for now, let's just take a look at this chart. So can you see that where the peaks exist is where the most amount of energy is going to be absorbed, whereas where the trough exists, where the low point exists, that's where the least amount of energy is going to be absorbed, meaning it's the most amount of energy that's reflected. Therefore, that's the color that you're going to see. On the IB exam, you might be asked to draw an absorption spectrum for chlorophyll. In this case, they're specific to chlorophyll A, so make sure you know how to do that. Once again, if I'm seeing blue and red, that means I have reflected blue or red. If I'm seeing green, that means that green is being reflected, whereas blue, red, and all the other colors are being absorbed. So if I were to look at the wandering Jew, right, it's a purple red leaved plant, what would the absorption spectrum look like there? Well, do you see how purple and red are the least absorbed colors, meaning those are the colors that are going to be reflected back. So purple red leaved absorption spectrum would look something like this. Here are some application questions. Why do pet stores sell fish tank lights that illuminate green? That prevents the algae growth, right? Because green is reflected back. It's not absorbed. If it's not absorbed, minimal photosynthesis is going to occur. What would happen if you grew plants in only green light? They're going to die. In only red and blue light, you would expect them to thrive. And then we did a water weed simulation, which set up an experiment to test the limiting factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis, such as color of light. Stephanie Castle has a really short video that outlines the differences in absorption of red, blue, and green light by chlorophyll. So let's talk a little bit about those different pigments. Chlorophyll A is a blue-green pigment, and it's going to participate directly in the light reactions. It's the primary pigment involved in photosynthesis. Then you've got chlorophyll B, which is known as an accessory pigment. It's got a slightly different structure, slightly different absorption. It is a light green pigment, and what it does is help funnel the energy from those different wavelengths over to chlorophyll A to ensure the most amount of absorption from that light energy possible. Carotenoids are your orange pigments. Similar to chlorophyll B, it is another accessory pigment. It can also funnel energy from other wavelengths to chlorophyll A. It also participates in photoprotection against excessive light so that it protects the plant. So collectively, all of these photosynthetic pigments can form an action spectrum. The action spectrum measures changes in some measure of photosynthetic activity. So, for example, it measures the changes in oxygen as the wavelength is varied, so as the color of visible light changes. Thomas Engelmann is the scientist who demonstrated the action spectrum. What he did was he took algae, which perform photosynthesis. So if they're doing photosynthesis, it makes sense that they would output oxygen. He then took aerobic bacteria, which will thrive in areas where there's the most oxygen. So he used the amount of aerobic bacteria growth to show that the oxygen produced in areas of blue light as well as areas of red light were the greatest. So that showed that varying wavelengths will vary the amount of oxygen.